Imagine a flash flood hit our school right now. How many of you think that our school could withstand the damages? Well, lucky for you, that's not very common in Hadley, so we don't have to test that out. I'm Cora White,
I'm Palber Zidig,
and I'm Tuba,
and we
advise you to turn around, don't drown.
a flood's path of destruction.
Although it's not very common in Hadley for these floods, it is common in coastal areas due to overflow, dry areas due to rough storms. Floods are very common with climate change, ice jams, tsunamis, hurricanes, and dam breaks. Little fun fact, 300 days out of the year, there are floods in the US, and 170 of those days are severe floods. There's a bunch of different types of floods: river floods, coastal floods, storm surges, inland floods, and flash floods. River floods are, of course, in the river and cause when the river rises a little bit too high. Coastal floods are when tides roll in and out of lowlands, causing those to flood. Storm surges are when there is a bunch of storms causing bodies of water to flood into areas nearby. Inland floods are the places that get flooded, like homes and local towns and cities. And flash floods, they're the most common type of flood. They happen with under 6 hours of notice, which is pretty bad because the National Weather Service likes to put out little warnings for towns nearby and places nearby about how bad the flood's going to be, and they use ranking system to do this. They use mild, moderate, and major to rank their floods. Mild is like the mild Taco Bell sauce. There's little to no damage, just like how there's little to no damage on your taste buds. Moderate is like the hot and fire sauce. There's a lot of damage, but not too much where it's overbearing. There's a way to recover. And major, well, that's like the Diablo sauce. Houses flooded, streets flooded, cars washed away. Everything's just flooded. But that's not where floods stop.
Recently, floods have been increasing in both severity and frequency over the years. The reason behind this is, of course, climate change. Storm patterns, melting ice, increased rainfall, and rising sea levels all contribute to the threats that floods pose. In order to combat these dangers, I decided to research on how floods are produced. One major cause of floods are storm surges. A storm surge is when the powerful winds of a storm, like a hurricane, push large amounts of seawater onto the shore. This can bring a dangerous increase in water levels that can reach up to 20 feet and can cause lots of damage. The geography of a coastline also has an impact on how these storm surges can affect the land. For example, if there is a concave shape, then that means more water can be pushed in. And if there is a shallow continental shelf, then it means that there's less space for water to gather underneath the ocean and is more likely to be pushed onto the shore. Another cause is the melting of snow and ice. As a result of warmer temperatures, ice has begun to melt prematurely, which has disrupted the gradual melting of snowpack. This causes places like rivers and streams to be unable to accommodate for the high levels of water. When these places receive extra water, it can cause the top layer of ice to break into chunks. And when these chunks get trapped, it can stop the downstream flow of water and form ice jams. This causes the surrounding area to quickly get flooded and can cause lots of damage because they can be very unpredictable. These can also be caused by high precipitation, since global warming has had an impact on that as well. The atmosphere has had more moisture due to higher levels of evaporation from oceans, rivers, and lakes. This means that rainfall will be more common because rain clouds now form at faster rates. Powerful downpours can quickly overwhelm natural drainage systems and river networks. These changes in precipitation patterns are also closely connected to the management of dams. Many dams are based on the historical data of rainfall, meaning that they are not fully equipped to handle today's rain levels. This causes lots of pressure to be built up on dams, and when combined with structural defects, like unstable land or outside damage, it can lead to destruction. One final cause of floods are rising sea levels, which can intensify events like tsunamis. When tsunamis form in the open ocean, typically through earthquakes, they rapidly gain elevation near shallow waters. With higher sea levels, they form at elevated starting points, which means that the water reaches greater heights and can extend further inland. As well as this, coastal areas often have a low elevation, which means that there's no natural barriers to stop incoming water. This means that the water can be trapped inland and cannot drain back into the ocean. The global mean sea level has increased 8 inches since 1880, but just half of this has been in the past 30 years. This is mostly caused by the melting of ice sheets and glaciers. So now, after understanding some of the causes of floods, we can now learn about the impact it has on people's livelihoods. We decided to conduct an interview with someone whose life was directly impacted by floods.
I interviewed Victor Moore, a member of the U.S. Army who lived in Savannah, Georgia before joining. He and his family went through 2 floods in just the span of a few years, both from hurricanes and both with equal severity. This caused buildings, homes, and cars to get damaged and even washed away. When water entered the house, that caused a bunch of furniture and all of their belongings to get destroyed. And this is where flood insurance comes into play. Flood insurance helps families with covering all the stuff that they had lost during the floods. But the only downside to this is flood insurance is quite expensive. When floods get too severe, water can enter through cracks in the foundation, windows, and sometimes even doors. This causes the structure to get weaker, discolored, and even sometimes a bunch of mold and mildew to grow. Mold and mildew can grow in 24 to 48 hours after an incident. And as water gets in there, it affects all of your possessions, things like appliances, electronics, and furniture. It'll ruin your plumbing, it'll ruin your washing machines and everything that is plugged into an outlet, and it can get rid of things like couches and beds, and like water will get in there and cause a lot of mold to grow. And this is really bad for animals and small children because it causes a lot of health risks. Also, with all of these things being destroyed and impacted, it causes a really big financial burden on low-income communities, and it can sometimes even leave people homeless. And it doesn't just affect people in rich coastal communities like Savannah, Georgia, but in low-income communities too.
Low-income communities often sustain the most damage from floods, yet they usually end up receiving the least amount of assistance from relief organizations. For decades, low-income communities have been forced into cheaper neighborhoods where there is a lack of protective infrastructure like levees, storm drains, and flood barriers, and inadequate drainage systems. This makes them much more susceptible to floods. Even if they try to move to higher quality areas, they will be stopped through practices like redlining and exclusionary zoning. Low-income communities often can't afford flood insurance, emergency supplies, or repairs, while wealthier communities can rebuild faster due to their money, media presence, and political influence over government aid. Even if they receive aid, such as the low-income communities don't, they could take years to rebuild and could never actually fully recover what was already there before. More people from these areas will continue to suffer at higher disadvantages, such as the destruction of roads.
Roads are what connect society. They help you to navigate your way to your friend's house, to the mall, and several other places. But unfortunately, they are vulnerable to water damage. So when floods occur, they tend to deform its structure. More specifically, the pavement's asphalt aggregate bonding, the adhesion cohesion that structures a road, weakens. They are then unable to bear heavy loads and, as I said before, deform, and these deformities can result in potholes. And say if the floodwater within the potholes were to expand, freeze and expand, the pothole will then expand itself, creating a bigger issue. While floods do break down roads, they also tend to carry items and scatter them across areas. Consequently, bags can cover cars, mirrors, and windows, and household items can hit and damage infrastructure, leading to possible injuries and deaths not only among the human population, but also among the animal population as well. Like us, animals have their own homes, and they need them to shelter themselves. But unfortunately for them, their houses are weaker and much more easily put in ruins when floods occur. So when the rushing water hits a tree, the tree tends to throw off the nests that were once placed upon them, and they also tend to fill burrows with mud and water. Floods also tend to erode lands, causing trees to uproot and dens to cave in, depriving many birds and burrowers of their homes. Sadly, this even happens within industries dedicated to helping animals, such as industrial farms. Industrial farms for their livestock, specifically, I'll be talking about like their poultry buildings. They're big, secluded areas with little to no efficient exit ways. And because of this, as water seeps in, it can continuously rise. The buildings itself don't really release the water, ultimately causing animals to drown. Deprivation of these natural resources can destabilize the economy. If a certain species were to be wiped out, say if they were like prey, the predators would take over and vice versa. Even a regular income can be hindered because for homesteaders, they usually tend to raise livestock for their families and themselves, and without it, their jobs would be in distress. But say if some animals were to survive, these animals would be inedible intoxicated because of the chemicals they intake when floods occur. Because as water accumulates in ditches, holes, and riverbanks near industrial facilities, there tends to be chemical spills, and floods pick these chemical spills up and put them in other areas where water tends to collect. There are two types of relationships between the water and the pollutants. There's non-point source pollution and point source pollution. Non-point source pollution is when things like motor oils, plastics, and household items fall into the water. Point source pollution is when specifically one facility emits chemicals and the chemicals then run off into the water. And within these two types of pollutions, there's two types of contaminants they emit. There's chemical, like salt, lead, metals, and pesticides, and there's biological, like bacteria, parasites, and dead animals. Now, going more into depth about what each pollution does to the economy. Poisonous pollution is majorly impactful on aquatic life as it carries many biological contaminants. These then seep through groundwaters, rivers, and eventually oceans, causing animals to be infected with hepatitis A, E. coli, norovirus, and several other pathogens and diseases. Non-point source pollution, on the other hand, occurs when items cover the surfaces of bodies of water, not allowing oxygen to reach the animals underneath. And as we all know, even animals underwater need oxygen to survive, and without it, their population diminishes. Now, connecting back to animal meat being chemically compromised. When animals digest any water after floods or eat any plants, they tend to intake chemicals along with it. Because as is known, plants intake water for nutrients, and say if they intake like chemically filled water after floods, they would themselves become intoxicated, and if eaten, animals are then more vulnerable to early mortality and several diseases. With this chemical dispersion comes along algae blooms. These further impact the issue as when they occur because of excessive amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus being emitted into the waters because of floods and natural disasters. And then, as the algae takes in this nitrogen and phosphorus, they then grow rapidly. And this overgrowth of algae covers the water surface, creating dead zones. The largest dead zone in the world, as you can see, I put a map up there, is in the Gulf of America, previously known as the Gulf of Mexico. And it stretches for 6,500 square miles. And just to think that much of the area is covered with algae, think of how many marine animals are impacted. Little to no oxygen and sunlight then reaches the underwater plants, depriving the animals of their food. And say if the algae were to die, this seems like it would be a solution, right? No, along with the algae, the oxygen levels deplete with it, causing all the marine animals to suffocate to death.
Although floods can be detrimental in many ways, there are some positive things that they can have on the environment and the wildlife to help them thrive. For example, when floods recede, they leave behind sediment and natural fertilizer that improves the soil quality. This can help the land provide nutritious vegetation and provide stable habitats for all the species living there. Also, regions like floodplains are reliant on floods to replenish the land. During dry seasons, floods are the reasons why ecosystems aren't completely destroyed and species don't go extinct. Fish populations also heavily rely on seasonal flooding to have safe breeding and spawning territories that can create balanced aquatic ecosystems. When finding solutions, it's important that we don't completely disregard some of the positive effects that floods can have on the environment. Our best outcome would be to maintain the flow of nutrients and replenish groundwater without the devastating impacts they can have on humans and animals through our proposed solutions.
Like these two said, floods impact animals a lot. And things we can do as a human race is build levees, dikes, seawalls, because they help prevent water coming in and overflowing through the fields that these animals live in, and all fill in the burrows that they live in as well. The water also affects the plants, the food, and the smaller animals that these animals eat, which causes issues for the animals that do end up eating them or leaves them to starve. Another thing we can do, which might be more impactful to the human race than the animal race, but it still helps both, is build a green infrastructure. And if you're like me, you have no clue what that is. But don't worry, I did the research for you. It's an eco-friendly, built-in ecosystem that reduces stormwater runoff and it protects floodplains from getting too filled. Lastly, one thing we can do to help people and pets inside the homes is America dry basement systems. They help improve homes by waterproofing the insides and outsides of homes, which is what they recommend. Sometimes it's not always cost effective to do both, but you could just pick one. But they prevent floods from taking away dreams of families.
To further go into ways we could decrease the effects of floods, there are two organizations taking charge. The first one is the ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers. They say that governments should adopt floodplain management systems, and with these regulations, they say people must regulate their land use, invest in flood mitigation like levees and seawalls, as Cora described earlier, and use prints of flood maps covering coastal areas. It is also written that these flood maps should include a key with the severity of rainfall and the possible rain rates over each individual area. The other organization I mentioned, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. These people map out designated areas based on risk of flooding to help keep people aware, along with helping to prevent major flooding or facilitate evacuation. FEMA helps homeowners and people with property get good insurance for when floods occur.
Now, with your newfound knowledge and a show of hands, who thinks that they're prepared to keep themselves, their families, and their pets safe from the floods? Thank you.